Hello, my name is Cameron McDonald and I'm a Sector Engagement Lead in the Prevention in Action Directorate here at Our Watch. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, Men in Focus in Practice, addressing masculinities and working with men in the prevention of men's violence against women. I would absolutely love to acknowledge and honour the traditional owners of the land on which I am coming to you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Working for a national organisation, I would also like to acknowledge and honour the traditional owners and custodians of country across Australia and pay my deep gratitude and respect to them, their cultures and their elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge the leadership embodied by First Nations prevention initiatives that address masculinities and work with men in ways that are trauma-informed, healing and accountable to women. As a non-Indigenous person living on Aboriginal land, I appreciate how much I have to learn and gain from being an aspiring ally to this work. On that note, I would love to acknowledge Our Watch's Changing the Picture resource, which lays out clearly what all people, particularly non-Indigenous people, can do to prevent violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Today's webinar will explore some of the key themes and approaches to preventing men's violence against women, as outlined in the Men in Focus Practice Guide that was launched in August of this year. This guide extends on the Men in Focus evidence review and seeks to bring the theory into practice. I'd like to acknowledge that development of the guide was funded by the Victorian State Government Department of Fairness, Families and Housing. I would also love to acknowledge the hard work and expertise of all members of the advisory group and peer review group and all of my colleagues within Our Watch who helped to develop this resource into the comprehensive, rigorous and creative guide that it is. That list of people is too long to mention all at once, but I will direct you to one of the first pages in the guide where all these people's names are listed and acknowledged. A couple of them are here today to speak at this webinar, which is very exciting. So the guide is long, but that's because it contains everything practitioners working in this field said that they needed, wanted and dreamed of. This includes suggested activities, useful resources, practitioner reflections, case studies, and lessons learned from the field, all of which are linked back to the evidence base of what works and ensuring that practice is based in and built on the feminist legacy of primary prevention of men's violence against women. I'd like to acknowledge that many people joining us today will have been touched in some way by men's violence against women. So on this note, please do take care of yourself and remember to reach out to 1-800-RESPECT and just getting that up on the screen, there we go, where you can speak to someone about any issues that this may raise for you. Similarly, if you personally are concerned about your behaviour towards women or perhaps know someone else who is, please call No to Violence's Men's Referral Service on 1300 766 491. Now, the way this webinar today is going to work is that only the only people who will have cameras on and will be able to be seen or recorded are myself, the panellists, and obviously the Auslan interpreter who you can see at the moment. They will be with us for the whole session today, as well as closed captions. So if you need access to the closed captions, you can select that function at the bottom of your screen. A recording of today's webinar, including all the accessibility aspects, will be available on Our Watch's website early in the new year. You can, and please do, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to ask questions of today's speakers. We strongly encourage you to send your questions through, as we will have time for Q&A towards the end of the session. And as we go, we will be sharing links to additional information and resources relevant to our discussion in the chat. Okay, so today's discussion will be framed by a keynote address from Carla McGrady, and then a short background into the Men in Focus evidence review by Shane Taz. We will then move into a panel discussion with 3 practitioners with whom we will tease out the guiding principles for effective and ethical practice in addressing masculinities and working with men and boys in the prevention of men's violence against women. We will then finish up with the audience Q&A. So first up, we're going to hear from our keynote speaker, Carla McGrady. Carla is the Manager of Innovation here at Our Watch. She oversaw the development of the Men in Focus practice guide. Prior to that, she also led the development of Changing the Picture, Our Watch's framework for prevention of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So I would love to welcome Carla to speak with us now.
Thanks, Cameron. Yama, everyone. I'm Carla McGrady. I'm a Gamilaroi woman living and working on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Meanjin. Today, though, I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Naarm. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I acknowledge that sovereignty over all of our lands has not been ceded, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to thank Cameron and Shane in particular for their commitment to this work, and to others, including all of the advisory group members that have contributed their knowledge and understanding to the development of this resource in many different ways. And of course, to the Victorian government for funding its development. As Cameron mentioned, I was his manager during the development phase of the practice guide. And I've had the pleasure of working alongside Shane for the last few years here at Our Watch. I don't necessarily consider myself to be any kind of expert in this field of work, but I do know how important it is to me in every aspect of my life. I've seen and felt the impacts of family violence and the trauma it leaves in its wake. As an Aboriginal woman in this country, I'm also very familiar with the systemic and societal impacts of violence that continue every day as a result of ongoing colonisation. The impacts of this are felt by all Aboriginal people all of the time. It plays a significant role in every aspect of our lives. We spend too much of our time grieving for loved ones we have lost to violence, directly and indirectly, carrying with us the burden of generations of trauma. But with that also comes generations of strength. Being an Aboriginal woman who works in primary prevention can be challenging. At times, we've often been expected to separate our race from our gender. Depending on the type of oppression and discrimination we experience at any given time and where that comes from. But these parts of our identity can't be divided in this way. And understanding intersectionality as a framework is essential when considering the work that needs to be done to overcome multiple forms of oppression experienced by women all around the world. Racism and the numerous ways in which it is perpetrated is violent. To know and understand how masculinity intersects with other ways that we identify ourselves and where we locate ourselves in society, including our race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, ability or age, requires us to apply an intersectional lens to working with men. Understanding the lived realities of people that experience violence is an integral part of this work and essential for engaging men in the prevention of violence against women. The Healing Foundation states that when men's healing programs are designed and led by First Nations people, remarkable things can happen. By reconnecting with cultural values, restoring identity, and building positive family and community relationships, community-led men's healing programs are recognising the centrality of self-determination and the strengths of First Nations cultures. In the many consultations and conversations I've had with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about what is needed to do this work, they all speak to the importance of working with our men and young people. Because what we want all of our people to experience is lives free from violence. And we can't do that unless we include men and work together in ways that promote healing for all of our communities. This doesn't negate the responsibilities that governments and broader society have to support this work and to consider also the role that they play in perpetrating violence against our people. There are numerous examples of engaging men and boys through the lens of culture and restoring identity and connection to who we are as a people. Community-led and self-determined work as principles of engagement are not new concepts. These ways of working have been talked about and recommended for decades. In primary prevention and government-funded programs, they're often labelled as innovative, but for some of us, it's just doing what has been consistently recommended, but rarely actually implemented and insufficiently funded. Changing the Picture talks about these principles for prevention practice in relation to preventing violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children. Because it's not just what we do that's important, it's also the way that we do it. Men in Focus tells us that masculinity is a set of expectations for how men should act and behave, but which many men are unable to meet most of the time. We live in a society that also imposes certain expectations on women more than men. And given the very nature of this patriarchal society and its design, some men are only aware of the additional labour, support, attention, care, and love they receive from women when it's no longer there. There is an incredible amount of invisible work emotionally, physically, and importantly, psychologically, that women have to do to feel a sense of safety in a patriarchal society. Boys and men are often taught to suppress emotions, and women are taught to carry that burden to keep everyone happy, or at the very least to keep things ticking along without too much disruption. World-renowned trauma expert Gabor Mate discusses an article in the New York Times that refers to women as society's shock absorbers to help explain the gender gap in women's experiences of chronic health. During COVID, he said, on top of their own duties, women took on alleviating the stress of their husbands and their children, and they felt guilty when they couldn't successfully do so. He states that women have always played that role in patriarchal culture. Black women in particular are often labelled as troublemakers for not being quiet about the additional burdens that we experience, or for simply not knowing our place. We know that dominant forms of masculinity intersect with gender inequality and other structural inequalities and social disadvantages, and with men's power and privilege to help shape men's violence against women. When I think about why First Nations women in this country experience such high rates of violence over and above that of any other group of women in this country, I try to place that in the broader societal context of who holds power and who doesn't. Australian society doesn't like to name white supremacy as a power structure that exists here. There is an endless debate about whether or not Australia is a racist country. That isn't something that's up for debate, in my opinion, and based on my own experiences. And we don't even need to look to the past to see evidence of this. At this very moment, we are seeing the lives of Aboriginal women and children taken, and the question is still being asked as to what role racism has played in their deaths. This broader societal context makes me think about the ways in which people will often take the power wherever they can get it, and usually from those they believe are beneath them. Oppressing women and promoting adherence to types of masculinity that are dominant and rigid causes harm to both men and women. Seeking to adhere to unattainable goals of what men should be, according to capitalist patriarchal ideals, hurts everyone. I imagine it is difficult to want to change a society and system that is designed with you in mind. particularly for those that hold and exert the greatest amount of power and control over the lives of others. The rates of violence against women will not change without enabling environments. Systemic and social change must happen alongside the work that men as individuals must also do. Even so-called good men engage in misogyny, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia and believe it's harmless, because many of them don't understand how these attitudes and behaviours drive violence, and because these behaviours and attitudes have always been acceptable or minimised in society. But it's not just that people don't understand, but it's the pervasive nature of sexism, racism, and other systems of power in our society. Some of us had to unlearn them quickly in order to survive, and others are resistant to unlearning because we benefit from them. These ideals or values permeate so much of our world, and we must actively resist perpetuating them. That's the thing that's not often understood when people reduce it to good and bad and notions of our society being better than that. Even the most well-intentioned men and women are still capable of perpetuating these ideals in their daily interactions or in their lives. We can't be better unless we know better and actively do better. Consideration of and engagement with men who value gender equality and equality more broadly have a desire to support change at every level of society is imperative. Providing support to initiatives and programs that already exist in this space and continuing to expand our knowledge of what works best and why is an important step in the right direction. Back to you, Cam.
Wow. Thank you so much for those powerful words, Carla. For me, I can never be reminded often enough of the very different expectations placed on me as a cisgendered man in society, and the things I take for granted that women especially don't get to take for granted. So yeah, I was super lucky to be supervised by Carla throughout the process of developing the Men in Focus practice guide. And the work has certainly benefited from her oversight and the wisdom and experience that she brings. So thank you, Carla. I would now like to introduce Shane Taz to speak. Shane is the Senior Policy Advisor on Masculinities here at Our Watch. He is the author of the Men in Focus evidence review that precedes the practice guide and was released in 2019, and which the practice guide was based on. Shane is going to provide us with a really important background on the national and international evidence underpinning Men in Focus and introduce the guiding principles for effective and ethical engagement of men and boys in the primary prevention of men's violence against women. So, welcome, Shane, and I'll share your slides.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Cam. And I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country as well, and here at Naarm, Melbourne, and pay my respect to the traditional owners of these lands. And also thank Carla again. I can never listen to you enough, and just the wisdom and all the leadership that you bring to that work. So what I thought I'd quickly do, and I'm going to be quite quick here, it's really just to contextualise and situate the masculinities and engaging men work within the prevention of violence against women work. And then I thought I'd highlight just a few key findings from the evidence base that we need to keep front of mind really when we're doing this work. And as Cam said, I'll be drawing on the Men in Focus evidence review. But just to say that review, it's an extensive review of the national and international evidence and research that has been produced by some people that are here on the panel, but many researchers, many different organisations, and a lot of work that has really been going on for decades. So addressing masculinities and working with men has become a central focus of prevention work. And we can really see it clearly in the national framework, Change the Story, for example, and also in the new national plan that was recently released. When we read through the prevention section of the national plan, which is the strategy to address this problem over the next 10 years, half of it is really about masculinities and engaging men, and some of the key actions there are really related to this work as well. So we can see there's been that real flip to thinking about perpetration. We know it's still the majority of time that people of all genders experience violence. We know the majority of time it's a male perpetrator. So it's really front and center of this work. And in Change the Story, we see, that it's really central to the drivers there. So the first part of this work and what we're really looking at is to address masculinities and to think about masculinities as key to understanding the gender drivers, and also key to understanding the overall social context. So not just gender inequality and everything that entails, but also all the other intersecting forms of inequality and discrimination as well. So really taking that intersectional approach and thinking about how men and masculinities are really implicated in all of that. And we know that they're very much at the center of that as well. The other part of the work, which we'll be discussing more so a little bit later on the panel, but it's the practical application of the work. So this is about the work we do with men and boys, so engaging men and boys, not just in their own reflections and work in their lives and in their relationships and on themselves in relation to masculinity, but also just engaging men in general, in gender equality and prevention work, so that they can be part of the solution as well. So just a few key points that emerge out of the evidence base. Firstly, that taking an intersectional approach is key. So not only for addressing masculinities and the drivers, but also in how we work with men, that we need to be taking an intersectional approach. And firstly, Carla really outlined that when we're working with men and boys, in particular communities of men and boys, sometimes that can look very different depending on who your audience is, which men you are seeking to engage and to work with. Around the drivers as well, we see in the masculinities work that there's strong intersections with other forms of inequality. So, for example, with the work preventing violence against LGBTIQ plus communities and people, we know there's a lot of crossover there. When we're talking about gender inequality, we also have to be thinking about cis normativity and heteronormativity, which are social processes that assume that being cisgender, being heterosexual is the normal, the proper, and is more valued. And all of our systems and structures and norms continually promote that and exclude and discriminate against those who do not have those experiences, or it's not their identity or the way that they live their lives. We know also with LGBTIQ people that the majority of perpetrators are also men. And we know that when we work, with, with men and boys around sexism and around violence against women, we've also got to think about how do we address homophobia as an expression of masculinity, or how do we work with cis men in violence against trans women, which we'll hear Star Lady speak about the trans femme resource a little bit later. But there we really see a lot of crossovers of the drivers, but also some distinct differences as well. So to think about particular and additional drivers when we're thinking about LGBTIQ plus communities. Also with working with men and boys, as Carla said, and as is outlined in Changing the Picture, for example, when you work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, we need to be thinking or looking at that whole layer of colonisation and thinking about the impacts of colonisation. So using trauma-informed approaches, and sometimes the very strategies that we're using will look very different. And of course, as Carla said, this has been led by First Nations communities and is a key principle as well for doing that work, that it is community-led. In terms of what we're talking about around socially dominant forms of masculinity, firstly, at the individual and community level, we know from the research that many men feel pressures from all parts of society to think and act in particular ways and to conform to particular stereotypes of masculinity. And they're here up on the screen. And if I said to anyone here, you know, what is a stereotype of masculinity? What is socially endorsed idea of masculinity? These are the kinds of ideas here that we've come up with. But because of these pressures, we know that some men will endorse and take on these attitudes and behaviours. And so, and all of this matters because the research and evidence shows us that when men conform to these socially dominant ideas, and again, to point out, these are colonially imposed socially dominant ideas of masculinity in Australia, that when they conform to them, they're more likely to engage in sexist and disrespectful behaviours, more likely to be homophobic and transphobic, more likely to perpetrate violence against women. And we'll hear Matt speak later a bit about the Man Box study, which it's a fantastic piece of research in Australia that really articulates some of those social pressures. And then, you know, men who feel pressure to conform and endorse them, and then what that relates to and what that links to in terms of attitudes and behaviours. And it also links as well to negative impacts on men's own health and well-being. Also at the individual level, we know that male peer relationships, while they're very important for men, very important sources of friendship, that at times that men bond and interact in ways or around these dominant ideas of masculinity. And at the broader social and structural level, I mean, these ideas and the pressures men are feeling and the expectations, they're not coming from nowhere. They're coming really from everywhere, from all different settings and contexts, whether it's in the media, in our sports clubs, at workplaces, in our communities, and so forth. And really all of this relates to the drivers and two particular drivers that are outlined in Change the Story, but driver 3 in particular, so rigid gender stereotyping and these dominant forms of masculinity. And then also driver 4, so male peer relations and cultures of masculinity. And outlined in Change the Story are a number of essential actions to address masculinities across all the different levels of society, and also to work with men and boys around masculinity and their male peer cultures. And just finally, what also came out of the research is that we really need some principles, some guiding principles for when we're doing this work. These evidence-based principles that we speak about here are intersectionality, gender transformative practice, strength-based approaches, maintaining accountability to women, and also to look for solutions across all levels of society. And whilst all of these principles really cross over and link together, but they are there listed separately, something we can reflect on separately in the work that we're doing, you know, to really help guide this work that we do with men. But I'll hand back to Cam because I know this is going to be articulated, I think, much more in a practical sense through the panel a bit later.
Thank you so much, Shane. And likewise, I was so privileged to be able to work really closely with Shane, and I thank him for all of his input into, well, the work he did originally with the evidence review and the input he had into developing the practice guide. So yeah, as Shane discussed, the guiding principles form the backbone of Men in Focus, and you know, it was a bit hard to know where to start with the practice guide, and so in the end we decided to use them as the backbone of the guide and use them as a reflective tool for people working with men and boys in prevention to see, think reflectively about how well their initiatives might be aligning with these 5 principles. So what I would love to do now is actually use the panel discussions to explore these guiding principles actually in practice. So I'd love to welcome our 3 panelists today to talk about their experiences. I'm going to ask them some questions that will generate some discussion, and whilst we're having this discussion, if it brings up some ideas for you or some questions that you have, again, I'll remind you and encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So without further ado, I would love to introduce the panel. First up, we've got Pia Cerveri, who today is going to speak about her work that she undertook in a former but recent role at the Victorian Trades Hall Council on safe and respectful workplaces. We also have Star Lady, who is the program manager at the Zoe Bell Gender Collective. She's going to speak, among other things, about the development of the TransFem resource. And Matt Tyler, who is Executive Director of the Men's Project at Jesuit Social Services, speaking about their whole of community approaches to working with boys and men in a variety of settings. So really terrific panel. Let's launch into it with the first question. Pia, I would love to ask you about your experiences, given that you've done prevention work in some very stereotypically male-dominated settings. Can you please tell us a little about your experiences in these settings, and what worked, what didn't?
Sure, thanks, Cam. I've actually worked in a lot of industries, so across many different areas of work, and more recently I had been working with construction. So there is a really big focus at the moment on construction becoming more gender equitable and having more women into that workforce, etc. So certainly the government has established some goals around trying to make quotas and so on. So in terms of those areas of work, construction in particular, I would say the key things are to not make assumptions. So don't go into those workplaces assuming, because we can make as many assumptions and stereotypes about that population that we might be working with as they might make about us as trainers coming in to talk about gender equity and gendered violence in the workplace. I think it's really important to not lecture or shame people. People have their views. We've all grown up in the systems and structures that Carla articulated really well. None of us can avoid the ways we've been influenced by a colonised society and a white supremacist society and a patriarchal society. So rather than going in and lecturing people and assuming we know more as trainers or educators, I think it's really important to collaborate and work together with the group that we're working with, rather than enforcing our ideas or applying our ideas, and also assuming we're not going to learn anything. So I guess one of the real delights that I got out of the work I did was that learning and the sense of connection, because I think that there are points of connection that we can make with people across all walks of life in all different circumstances that can surprise us, but that are invaluable. So for me, I think some of those key things are to not lecture, not shame people, remain curious, but genuinely curious about why people think what they think, where those ideas come from, and try to engage in discussions, whilst keeping those discussions respectful and, not allowing other people potentially in the room to be injured by the conversations, but certainly to try to find that, what I always refer to as a point of connection. What is it that we connect over more than where we disagree or disengage? So in some of those areas of work, some of the key areas were around safety in the workplace. I was working in the trade union movement, and safety is a key issue. gendered violence, sexual harassment are safety issues in any setting, and it's not different from a trip hazard or a fall hazard. It's the same kind of issue that a psychosocial injury can occur, a psychological injury can occur, sorry, from a psychosocial hazard. Gendered violence, sexual harassment are that. And so it's really also about trying to find what is it that we're trying to provide here. So what are the values? What do we want to set and establish in this workplace to ensure that everybody who comes in here is safe? But also, how do we want to engage with each other in ways that are authentic and genuine? That doesn't mean everyone at work has to be our best friend by any means, but it does mean that we do have to have frameworks and standards that we'll adhere to. And so if we put it in that setting, which worked very well for us working in that OHS safety framework, we know it's ridiculous to suggest that someone climbs a ladder that's not properly secured, that doesn't have somebody else spotting and assisting with that. We wouldn't even expect people to do that sort of thing anymore on a work site. So in the same way, we would want to see that we start to shift how we use language and talk about people and exclude people in workplaces because of some of our attitudes, beliefs, and ways of behaving towards others.
Thanks so much, Pia. And yeah, I can definitely put my hand up and say that I've learned not to stereotype and go in with preconceived conceptions of sort of which men will be interested and engaged and which won't in gender equality work. So yeah, really good reminder. Thank you. Star Lady, I'd love to hear about, in your developing of the website TransFem, what have you learnt about the drivers of men's violence towards trans women and trans feminine people?
Yeah, so in my, I guess TransFem is really a pilot program in around the prevention of men's violence against trans women. And as part of that pilot, I interviewed over 30 trans women and cisgender men, across Australia. And so I did interview a series of men. And so some of the things that we found was that although many of the drivers of violence against trans women are actually the same as cis women, there were some additional drivers, and that included transphobia, transmisogyny, and cisnormativity that sort of like drove this, I guess, the stigma, shame, and negative societal attitudes towards trans women and towards the relationships. It stigmatized the relationships between trans women and cis men. And this contributed to a number of factors that negatively impacted men. And so many of the men I interviewed talked about how there was really poor visibility between the relationships of trans women and cis men in broader society, like in the media, within their communities, within their sort of families. And often they talked about they knew no other men who were in relationships with trans women. They also talked about being negatively impacted by the myth in society that views men who are in relationships with trans women as gay, or that it's a homosexual relationship. And obviously there is like embedded transphobia within this, where society is not seeing trans women as women. But it also talks about underlying sort of like homophobia within society and sort of like dominant forms of masculinity that are homophobic, running through it, as well. The men also talked about how they didn't feel that there was support from their family, friends, and community in and around their relationships. And what we actually found was there was a really big connection. If the family and friends of men were supportive when he disclosed that he was in a relationship with a trans woman, that relationship was much more likely to be long-lasting and healthy. But when the families of or friends shamed him for his attraction to or relationship towards trans women, it often put pressure on that relationship, where the relationship broke down, or there was a direct link to him perpetrating intimate partner violence. And so our community is really sort of like driving this violence. There was also complexities in regards to cultural and religious contexts from people from different cultural or religious backgrounds. And also the men talked about there was actually no services, you know, for them to go. They didn't feel that there was anywhere where they could get support and talk about their relationships with trans women. And I think this really sort of like highlights that the relationships between trans women and cis men have been really historically excluded from our frameworks in terms of like prevention of violence, or in particular, we don't see any of this work happening within the men's behavior change programs. And I think some of that comes from historically, mainstream services have looked at this issue. It's like, oh, it's an LGBTI issue. But many of the men identify as heterosexual and don't engage in LGBTIQ communities, or they might be bi plus men, but they still might engage a lot in LGBTI communities, while LGBTI services view it as, oh, well, these relationships are heterosexual, therefore we don't need to do anything. And so this is, we're talking about some of the most stigmatized relationships in our society, and it does drive violence. We've seen some over the last few years, some really prominent murders of trans women, in particular trans women of color who might be migrants, who might be sex workers, and we just haven't seen a sector response or a service response. And it's trans women, I think, in particular, feeling like, are our lives not as valued as cis women's lives? And until we as a sector and a community and as a broader society begin to value trans women's lives, we're not going to see that sort of change.
Thank you, Star Lady. And I've heard you talk about this before, and it breaks my heart just to think about and hear about how much extra and unnecessary violence and mental distress occurs because of the stigma in our society, and homophobia and transphobia. And it reminds me, as a cis het guy myself, how much of an important role I do have to play in addressing homophobia and transphobia. Thank you. Matt, how about you? I would love for you to tell us about what it means to take a whole of approach, whole of school or whole of community approach, for example, to working with men and boys in prevention, particularly because, these are the sorts of approaches you take in your work.
Yeah, thank you, Cam. It's really good to be with you, and also Star Lady and Pia. And congratulations to you, Carla, Shane, and our watch more generally on the work you've led as part of the Men in Focus initial report, and then the practice guide. Of course, it's a really valuable resource for folks. I'll start, Cam, just with a little bit of context about our work for folks who aren't familiar, and then come to the question regarding whole of approaches. The Men's Project sits within Jesuit Social Services, and as an organisation, we've worked for 45 years with men and boys, and oftentimes men and boys in crises. Folks who have spent time in prison, who have used and experienced violence, oftentimes as kids, have been in child protection, or are experiencing acute mental health episodes. And the challenges I've just touched on, they're many oftentimes gendered. I don't need to tell this audience about, the facts around the use of violence and the reality that, it's overwhelmingly due to the behaviour of men. But even in our schools, 80% of expulsions in Victorian schools are boys. And so the Men's Project was established to do more, to intervene earlier and get to some of the underlying root causes of these crises, noting they're complex and multifaceted. But something we were hearing over and over again from our frontline staff is that stereotypical ideas about what it means to be a man, and Shane touched on our Man Box research a moment ago, they were underpinning some of these crises. And so that was our first and arguably foundational piece of work, was our Man Box research. And informed by that research, we conduct primary prevention work across a range of settings, schools, community organisations, local councils and workplaces. And in doing that work, we take or seek to take a whole of approach. And I do want to say one thing before jumping into what that means, Cam. We've benefited tremendously from our partnerships with women's health organisations. They've been adopting this type of approach to the work for literally decades. And so I just want to call out the contribution they've made to this work and how grateful we are to partner with them in a whole range of ways. So what does that mean in terms of a whole of approach? I think to ground my response, I'll go to our work in schools and what it means to take a whole of school approach. I think first, working with multiple influences on boys' lives. Of course, work with students themselves, but also professional development for teachers and building a shared language and understanding with parents as well. I think second, facilitating prevention work in multiple ways, inside and outside the classroom. There's, of course, in Victoria, we've got the benefit, I think, of having the Royal Commission into Family Violence, which has provided the foundation around the Respectful Relationships curriculum. And there's almost 40 folks across the state with responsibility for effectively implementing that curriculum, which has really put Victoria, I think, well ahead of some other states and territories. But a whole of approach is broader than just that curriculum. It's outside the classroom as well. The way teachers role model to students, the way teachers interact with each other, the roles they play at events, who brings the morning tea, who cooks the barbecue, really simple signals that students pick up on in terms of stereotypical gender roles, how a school responds to disclosures and incidents of violence, really foundational things around school policies. All too often, as part of enrolment, the parent who identifies as female in a sort of a heterosexual couple will be listed first on an enrolment form, and therefore are the ones who are contacted when the child is sick. And so there's a range of things outside the classroom that can be addressed by schools to push on issues around gender equality that we know are linked to the prevention of violence. And then the third thing, as it relates to a whole school approach, is embedding this into business as usual. The contrast here would be having respectful relationships days or one-off workshops. This has to be embedded into the way things are done and ideally reinforced through sporting clubs, through community groups. It's one of the reasons why we work with councils, because they're a really important centralised organisation who has influence into a range of organisations across communities. Ken, the final thing I'll say is just a reflection on why a whole of school approach is important. One of the really important findings from our Man Box research, which sometimes I don't talk about a lot, but I think goes to the reason why we seek to take a whole of approach, is that we know the majority of men and boys are perceiving social pressures to adhere to some of the ideas that Shane touched on, that an inverted commas real man acts tough, sorts out problems on his own, asserts aggression and control to get respect, has as many sexual partners as possible, these stereotypical constructions of masculinity. And yet we also know that far fewer numbers of men and boys personally endorse these ideas themselves. Arguably still too many, but this discrepancy highlights that there's diversity with regards to men and boys. One example, 43% of respondents to our survey said that they perceive social pressure that suggests that a man should always have the final say about decisions in his relationship or marriage. That drops to 27% when men are asked whether they personally endorse that idea. Now, still too many, but highlighting that diversity is a really important part of the work. And boys in school, and for that matter, men more generally, will tune in to the messages that influences in their lives are sending. And we know that men routinely misperceive other men's attitudes around gender. They routinely overestimate the sexist attitudes of other men. And so we've got to bring these attitudes to the fore. And a really important part of the work is equipping men and boys to call out sexist comments, to call out violence, because that type of bystander behaviour can really have a significant effect on cultures, because men can see what other men think about behaviour such as that.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I think it's a beautiful demonstration about how the work of Jesuit Social Services spanned primary prevention, but also early intervention and other programs supporting the well-being of boys and men, to show that those aren't separate, and actually men being allies or aspiring allies to gender equality is actually important. And it's about challenging those structures. Something else you said reminded me of something a colleague said, that we place so much pressure on young people to change, to have healthier relationships, yet young people have the least power in our society. They can't even vote. And so unless we are making those changes at those higher levels in simultaneous to doing respect for relationships education, for example, then it's not fair. And lastly, thank you for mentioning the importance of remaining accountable to women. That's one of the guiding principles. And so that's about how this work, we remain accountable to the history of feminist work in this area, but also feminist-based approaches and theories to this work. So thank you. Back to you, Pia. I'd love to hear from you what taking a strengths-based, intersectional, and a gender transformative approach. That's just 3 of the 5 guiding principles all in one. What does that mean to you in your prevention work, or how does that look, please?
I think that it's really important, again, to find those meaningful moments, because I think that Matt's touched on a whole lot of evidence that I've seen in the work I've done, which is that, yes, on the surface, yep, we're all acting like this, we're all talking like this, we're, blah, blah, there's all that sort of front that people put up. But actually, once we've done training with people, especially when we get a longer opportunity, so usually a couple of days, this would definitely start to come through. We'll start to have really different conversations where those personal endorsements are actually not there, and you'll start to hear quite different stories from some of the participants, men and women in the room, around what they think is actually acceptable or true or reasonable in a workplace setting. So for me, I think that in terms of the strengths focus, definitely to me, it's about, again, going back to those principles I talked about earlier, about remaining curious, not coming in as an expert to talk over people or down to people, but actually to talk with people about what it is they think, what it is, why they think it, but also what do they want to do about it in the environment we're in this case, where I was working, workplace settings. But not only that, there are frameworks like OHS legislation that does actually determine what is safe or not in a workplace. So in fact, also, how are we going to utilise that? Like, how are we going to make that work regardless of what attitude we come to work with? How are we going to actually make sure that the OHS framework can be applied here to keep people safe? So I think in doing that, I guess collaboration, not punishment, not lecturing, not talking down to people, and also genuinely not assuming that as a trainer you know everything, because you never do. And if you haven't learned at least one thing every time you do a training session, then I think you're missing the point. Because, every time I've walked out of a training session, I have always gone, wow, that was really interesting, that point that was made, or gee, I'd never thought about it like that before. So I think that's really critical. I think in terms of intersectional and gender transformative, I would never use those words when I'm talking in that context, because I think people would just say, well, get out of here. That's, that doesn't sound like what we're here for. So for me, I think it's around really trying to recognise the multiple ways that oppressions and also privileges manifest, and that can change at different times. So, we know overall that certain people are much more discriminated against, much more harmed in our society, much more marginalised, and obviously certain people are more often in positions of power and control over others, and we know that's supported by patriarchy and capitalism and colonisation, etc. But there are times as well where we have to recognise that there's intersections, like in a workplace, around class, around roles that people hold in a workplace, around the different positions people have. So sometimes we have talked about what it's like to have power over one, that most of us have at some point had that experience. We've had a moment, whether some of us have had it constantly in our lives, some of us have had it fleetingly, but most of us understand something about that concept. So I guess it's trying to tap into people's empathy or understanding, to get people to walk in the shoes of another for 5 minutes, just to try and think about what that actually means. What would that be like? Maybe not even having necessarily, I mean, I'd say a frank conversation, but not necessarily a confronting or scary conversation about that, but to try and just flip it a little bit, to get people to have to really think about what that means, what that's like, and then see the change, because you can see people, you can see the penny drop with people. We built into our training a lot of very experiential activities, so things to try and get people to really feel as well as think about it and talk about it. So lots of movement, lots of getting up and talking to different people in the room, lots of trying to get people to try something that they wouldn't normally try. And we found that actually gets people engaged in a discussion and training in a different way from people just, you know, sitting in a room talking or being talked at, etc. And to me, that's where I could see the penny drop with people. And it was quite profound at times to see somebody really click and think something or see something, sometimes articulate that in the room, or sometimes come back to us later and talk about that. But another key thing, just relating to Matt's point, and I know we haven't got heaps of time, so I'm going to sum it up really quickly. It's also not enough just for us to go in and do that training, and we can have those moments, we can have those experiences. People can even leave the room feeling quite inspired, and hopefully many people that I've worked with did. But it's not enough if we're not going to change the very systems and structures within which they're working and living. So again, in terms of power in a society, sure, we can train people, we can say to people, you know, this, this and this, but if the workplace and the broader society isn't prepared to change and challenge some of those systems and structures, it's not going to hold up, because those people are just, it becomes a tick box exercise, it becomes lip service. People may still hold the intention to make those changes, but actually it takes a lot more than just an hour or two of training, or even 2 days of training. It really needs to be that, I would say, whole of workplace, but whole of society transformation in order to see that sustained change that we are hoping to see.
Thank you so much, Pia. Yeah, rich information and considerations in there. And I was equally appreciative to be working with you on this guide, Pia, and there's some really helpful, really insightful reflections in the guide from Pia, along with other people involved on the advisory group. So yeah, thank you. Over to you now, Star Lady. I guess building on the discussion we had previously, how can we work with cisgender men and boys in regards to building their capacity to have respectful relationships with trans women and trans feminine people?
I think first we just need to start off with having a better understanding of what does that violence look like towards trans women. And so we are talking about, you know, statistically, really high, incredibly high rates of trans women experiencing sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and or broader family or community violence. And some of what that can also look like is like often trans women, because of like the men's stigma and shame in around their attractional relationships with trans women can have challenges in accessing public relationships. Like men will often try to force trans women, those relationships will be secret and hidden. And so it'll be like, well, men will only want to meet trans women in their private residences or in hotels. They may not allow, they may not introduce the trans women to their broader friends, family, or community. We see an incredible amount of pressure on trans women to like pass as a cisgender woman or to be like hyper feminine. I imagine all women, you know, have that pressure in and around expressing femininity, but I guess it's exacerbated for trans women. We also see issues around men controlling trans women's bodies in terms of gender affirmation and medical affirmation that often center on men's own personal desires rather than what trans women want for their own sort of bodies and to affirm their own gender identity. We also see, I guess, this really high rates of trans women because we're so othered by society. We sometimes see where, I guess, men often talk about because of societal stigma and shame, where it's like, I'm attracted to trans women, I like having sex with trans women, but actually my family and my society expect me to marry cis women. And so what we end up seeing is that trans women are highly objectified and fetishized based upon their gender identity, their bodies, skin color, race or ethnicity because of that. And also, unfortunately, because we haven't included trans women in like our respectful relationships content, we haven't included trans, we don't see them in film, those relationships. Sadly, the place where men are first exploring or first seeing their sort of like desires or their attraction towards trans women, where they're exploring that is through incredibly misogynistic porn. Because of that, and often this porn is violent, it's degrading, it's humiliating of trans women. And so men often reenact that. And trans women talk about being pressured to be, you know, to dress in a certain way or to reenact scenes from pornography. And the only way that we're going to change this is if we start embedding respectful relationship content that includes trans women in all of our work and sort of men's behavior change programs, until we start bringing it into respectful relationship contents, until everyone in all parts of their society starts talking to all the men in their life about respecting trans women, you know, because what was really clear in some of the research of trans women, in particular, when cis men's families, when they were young, when their parents or broader family members had explicit conversations with you, it's okay, whoever you love, whoever you have a relationship in your life, I'm going to support you, I'm going to stand by you, and I will respect you for that. Those men were growing up and having respectful relationships with trans women. So there's some of the things I think we do. We need to be having these conversations with men.
Amazing. Thank you, Star Lady. And I think you articulated so clearly that old, how harmful and that impact of objectification of women that men we can do. And I think in case Star Lady didn't make it blatantly clear already why it's so important, I think as a cisgendered man myself, I see my struggle allied with trans, non-binary people. I really appreciate the leadership in that, because I see how trans, non-binary people help to challenge those really rigid gender stereotypes that Shane referred to in his presentation, that we know the evidence is there, are harmful and they lead to violence. So even if it might seem like a niche or a fringe or an unrelated issue, it's really clear how it's not. It's a mainstream issue which affects everybody. So thank you. Matt, I'd like to ask you about, in the extensive work that Jesuit Social Services has been undertaking with men and boys through the Men's Project, what are some early signs of change that you and your colleagues are noticing?
Thanks, Cam. I'm always nervous. I'll be up front answering a question on progress, particularly in light of what Star Lady just shared. There is just so much work to do, and so I think it's important to hold that as I share a few reflections. I think first, to understand what's changing, we've got to acknowledge what's come prior. And you and others have touched on this, Cam. Our work at the Men's Project is only possible because of work that's been led by pro-feminist organisations and by women who have fought to put issues of family violence, sexual harassment and assault into mainstream discourse, against the reality that too often women and other marginalised groups have been disbelieved and had their voices silenced. And so I think that's the context against which progress sits as well. I think there's increasing recognition that to end violence, we've got to focus on changing the behaviour of men. And the Victim Survivors statement in the National Plan, I think, put that really plainly, and I'm quoting here, abuse and violence is a problem for victims, but it is not a victim's problem. And that sentiment, I think, is reflected in the Respect at Work report. It's reflected in changes to parental leave in terms of the expectations around shared care. It's reflected in the Victorian government's Second Free from Violence Action Plan. And so we're seeing, I think, those policy sentiments translate into a conversation which is less about engaging men and boys in violence prevention. I think that's, as Carla's pointed out, it's taken as given, and more about how best to do this work. And I'll jump into one example where I've been encouraged by the response, and that is the response to Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate is not unique. Andrew Tates will come and go, but I think what has characterised the response amongst the organisations we're working with to this homophobic, transphobic, classist, misogynistic bile is that we are leaning into a conversation about what some men are getting from engaging with content like this. And I think oftentimes the appeal of the content and the hierarchies in it is a quick fix. We know it's a quick fix. The folks who are tuning in today likely know it's a quick fix to issues related to identity and belonging. This thug life, alpha male narrative can be really alluring. And in some contexts, challenging that can result in immediate sanction, and sanction through language, and it's gendered language. Don't be a girl, don't be a pussy, harden up. And at the core of these destructive dynamics are fears about identity, connection and belonging. And I think Jess Hill moved the conversation forward through her book, See What You Made Me Do. And I'm quoting here, men may be powerful as a group, and oftentimes they're told they're entitled to power. They don't necessarily feel powerful as individuals. And I think this is, one of the principles in the Men in Practice focus guides around intersectionality. If we're going to be working with men and boys, we've got to engage with what they think. And Pia touched on a little bit of this, not making assumptions. Increasingly, we're seeing an appetite to do that. We're seeing an acknowledgement that this work is challenging. Teachers putting up their hand in schools to say, look, I'm not sure how to deliver topic 7 and 8 of the Respect for Relationships curriculum. It's challenging content. And before you stand up in front of a classroom of kids, it's likely you're going to need a bit of time to self-reflect yourself on what you think about some of these ideas. And so I'm encouraged by the movement towards an acknowledgement that it's not whether this work should take place or not, it's how we should be doing this work, and a recognition that in order to deliver something like the Respect for Relationships curriculum, we're going to have to invest in workforce capacity building and support staff to engage with the men and boys that they're in front of in schools.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you, panelists. We're now going to look at some of the questions that have come in. And of course, there's a question about backlash and resistance. Pia, I'd love to ask you about this, if you don't mind answering. Pia, what are your experiences of backlash and resistance in your prevention work? And what are some effective strategies you've taken to preparing for it and addressing it?
Yep. Well, it is a great question because I think it's inevitable. I mean, it just always happens in this work as far as I have experienced it. And it can range from really covert, sort of insidious subtler kinds of behaviours and comments through to very hostile and overt. I think that I think it's really important as a practitioner that you're aware that it's going to happen if you embark in this work, and that if you are representing any of those groups that you're talking about, like I'm a woman, I'm a queer woman, I mean, I'm going to actually also have gendered violence directed at me in the course of doing the work, in addition to also working with talking about other groups as well. So I think it's really key to know that it's going to happen, but to have something set up in your work setting that ensures that you are also protected. So one of our practices was to always have 2 trainers available, to always have capacity to finish at the end of the day. Like if you wrapped up training at 3, then you were finished for the day. You didn't have to go back and try to answer emails or do work like that. If you would be able to access your EAP, or there would not also be expectations that you would continue through a session if it became too dangerous, essentially, for you or others in the room. Having said that, though, there's never a time that I've had to actually shut a class down. I have asked people to leave at times when things have gotten too hostile, and set that limit, because that's unacceptable. But the vast majority of the time, what I would say is, going back to Matt's point, it's actually asking, where's this coming from? What are you thinking? And genuinely meaning it. Because again, if you falsely ask somebody a question, just to pay lip service or to pretend that you're interested, it will come off as patronising, and people will see right through it, and it won't have any good effect at all. But I think my experience is, in the majority of the time, that somebody expresses pushback, and it can come from all corners. And again, I think you cannot assume who's going to give the pushback, because I also think, in my experience, where I've experienced backlash and pushback, it hasn't come from who I might assume it's going to come from when I check the room out. It actually can come from the most surprising quarters. But what I find really, really fascinating about it is, once you start to ask why, but why, in a genuinely curious way, you can really unpack the conversation, and it often leads to a whole lot of other things that are going on for that person. And I also think it relates a little bit to Matt's point about people not necessarily feeling that powerful, or feeling intimidated, or sometimes genuinely not understanding what's trying to be achieved, and feeling that, they need to push back, they need to ask, they need to defend something. But once we actually talk about it some more, it opens up the space. Other people in the room can also contribute to the conversation. And it also often shifts where that person started. I'm not saying it's a magic wand and that, they walk out of there being completely like, yeah, right on, I'm a feminist and I love the, this, that, and the other. But often it is actually, there's often something behind it. And often, to me, what I found that's behind it is a fear of, what am I going to have to do? A fear of, but hang on, I don't always feel like a really powerful top dog, and I'm sitting here hearing that I am, because I'm a white cisgendered man. Sometimes it's about feeling worried about, what's going to happen with my job if, I make a mistake. Like there's a lot of layers to it. And I couldn't even name all the different things that have come through when we've had these conversations. But again, the second that you talk down to someone, the second that you dismiss someone, the second that you invalidate someone, then to me, you're just ending a conversation that could really go somewhere interesting. So in fact, I also think in education and training, you need to build space in for some flexibility in what you deliver in the curriculum, because if you just try to power through, you're not going to get time and capacity. But on a final note, I'm never suggesting that something dangerous should be upheld or supported. So there are definitely times where you have to draw a line in the sand, and someone might have to leave the room, or a situation might have to be diffused. But as I said, it's been rare in my experience.
Beautiful, thanks, Pierre. And I love all those, really practical strategies you've outlined, and especially that, asking questions. And I'd just love to add in my experience. yeah, often resistance is there initially, and that can actually be a really useful energy to work with. But how I've seen these conversations be transformational. And I do worry sometimes about messages being softened out of fear of the backlash and resistance, rather than thinking more how we can deliver those messages more strategically to create that transformative change. So thank you. Matt, I can see you with, I'd love for you to add.
Yeah, just a brief one, Cam, to add to what P shared. I think for folks who identify as men on the call, you know, I'm a cisgendered, straight, able-bodied white man. I think there's an opportunity to bring your own shortfalls into the room. This work is personal, it's political, and we will have all fallen short at some stage over the journey. And I think bringing that into the room can, at times, not always, I think Pia makes points that the backlash is diverse, that can diffuse a little bit of that defensiveness if you can reveal that, you know, I'm still learning, I still fall short on this work, and I'm in it every day. And so bringing some of that vulnerability to bear can diffuse a little bit of the pushback in my experience. I think the second thing to say is it's easy to for folks to think, again, including myself, that this is somehow out there. This isn't actually relevant to this community. It's you know, the drivers of violence and violence itself is not within the room that we're facilitating in. And what we try to do where funding permits is to understand the perspectives of the community we're working in up front, and in an anonymised way, bring that survey data into the room to engage them in a conversation. It's not us telling them what they believe, it's using survey data they've given us and mirroring that back to them. And again, that can just decrease some of the heat, because it's not a set of assumptions. This is real information, albeit imperfect, but real information that the audience that you're engaging with has provided to us.
Beautiful. Thanks for that really fascinating insight, Matt. Star Lady, is there something you'd like to add to this discussion?
Yeah, I think in terms of like backlash and resistance, you need to do your research in terms of like, you know, I mean, I think of like homophobia, transphobia, racism, and you need to prepare yourself. Often we're talking about making big societal changes in the workplace or with our systems, and you can't engage in creating that sort of social change without thinking about backlash and resistance and about preparing. So if you are making really big changes to sort of like outdated systems, then it's really important that you explain why you're doing that. You prepare information sheets, and you inform like staff or your service users, your clients, the people, your stakeholders. You let them know why you're making these changes and give the sort of like reasoning sort of behind it. And then you prepare statements to prepare for that backlash. If you don't prepare, like I think about transphobia, and often we're seeing organizations really sort of develop the trans-inclusive practice, and they make these big changes, and then they just forget about how rampant transphobia and transmisogyny is within our society at the moment. And what you end up doing, though you're trying to create change, is that it gets trolled, you know, those changes get trolled or they get attacked, and it ends up causing further harm to the very people that you're trying to support or you're trying to engage. And so you really need to really think about how you're going to manage that sort of resistance, because, you know, in particular areas it will come. And I think sometimes I've seen a naivety of mainstream services in making these changes.
Thank you, Star Lady. And once again, you know, thank you for that reminder, that really impassioned reminder of the emotional hurt or pain that can come. And that's the reason enough why doing this work is so important. I know that, you know, personally, myself being a cisgendered man and working with men, too often we don't dwell in the emotional side of the pain of this field, and I think it is important to remember that and get out of our heads and remember that lived physical experience and emotional experience. We are fast running out of time. I can't believe we're almost at an hour and a half. So look, we've got time for closing comments from each of the panelists. So up to you. You can each have about 2 minutes to either answer this question. There's one more question around what are some new directions that you're taking in your work with men and boys. You can close on that, or just any other closing thoughts you want. But yeah, look, this is a reason why the why the guide is so long, because it's such nuanced, complex work, but at the same time, it's work that we need to just get out there and do. So don't be daunted by the length of the guide. You can also just sort of search for different areas of interest and focus in on those. Thank you for putting the link again to the guide in the chat. So yeah, just in closing with your 2 minutes, what are some new directions that you're excited about taking, or any other closing thoughts today? Start with you, Pia.
I think for me, it's really, I'm always open-minded about what I'm always seeing opportunities for what could be introduced to my work, and trying to constantly update my knowledge, update how I approach things, and really listen to my colleagues and people like yourselves that I've been on this panel with today. So I think if it's kind of like this constant continuous improvement, I think it's really necessary in this work. So yeah, I would encourage anyone in this work to continue along those lines as well, to just ensure that you're not getting out of date in the work you do, and keep reflecting on how you approach it and where your own blind spots might be.
Thanks so much, Pia. And another good reminder that we do talk a lot about self-care and the importance of self-care. We shouldn't do that at the expense of collective care, but even more importantly, what our organisations do to support us in this really challenging work at times. Thank you. Star Lady, do you have closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to see, more men and more men's behavior change programs really step up to include, this work in addressing men's violence against trans women. I think, for too long, that has been a burden that's been solely left on trans women, and that actually we need men to really sort of step up and make this sort of like a focus. It's not a side issue. Many men are in relationships or attracted to trans women, and that we need you to really step up as allies and to address it. It's not an LGBTI issue. This is like a mainstream issue. And just like TransFem is a really extensive resource. It has a section for men. It has a section for trans women. It is a community-based resource, but there are learnings in it. Use some of the learnings in TransFem and embed them in the resources, in the conversations that you're using. Use the quotes that exist within TransFem. Reach out to us and work with us about how you can be inclusive, because the violence against trans women, it has to stop, and we need a greater focus on it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Star Lady. And lastly, Matt.
Thanks, Cam. I'll touch on 2 new directions, although to Carla's sentiments up front, they do rest on what we've known for a very long time, and that is the core of this work is about patriarchy. We live in a society that continues to value the masculine over the feminine, and we know that patriarchy bestows unfair benefits on men while subjugating women, and that reality has got to be at the core of this work. We also know, and Bell Hooks wrote about this in 2004, that, and I'm quoting here, the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Patriarchy demands all males kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And there's a lot spoken about healthy masculinities. I think we need to do a better job of defining what that actually means. Professor Flood has provided some principles to guide that thinking, and I think they're helpful principles that, healthy masculinities, or what we are increasingly referring to as healthier identities, noting the limitations of continuing to foreground masculinity, are gender equitable, diverse, they're not unique to men and boys, and they're healthy for men and boys themselves. And I think in facilitating healthier identities, it's not enough to point out that rigid attachments to man box norms may be at the root of issues around violence against women, or that violence is not acceptable. We've got to actually equip men and boys with the skills to detach from some of these ideas. And so one avenue we're pursuing is facilitating a better understanding of context. We can't create another man box. There's not one set of attitudes and behaviour that would be appropriate for every context. And, you know, we're all at risk of just overgeneralising. It's hard to slow down. You know, dominance and competitiveness, they can be really helpful traits in some contexts, on a sports field, for example, but can be extremely unhelpful when you're in a conversation with an intimate partner. And so facilitating that turning off autopilot, we do a lot of work around habits, is something that we're exploring. And then the second thing that we're pursuing is developing skills that enable men and boys to develop a closer connection to themselves, a better understanding of themselves. We know that even a simple skill like describing emotions can mitigate the link between experiencing distress and anger. And so that's something that we're working on, promoting those critical self-reflection skills that, again, need to be taught.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, panellists. I'd like to welcome back Carla and Shane as well, so that, well, I'd love to thank the audience today. I'd love to thank you all for your attendance and your interest in this important topic. Thanks again to all our incredible, wonderful, inspiring speakers and panellists. Thank you to our funders, the Victorian Government. My little take-home message, if I was to distill it down to one sentence, is that not all men perpetrate violence, but all men can and should be part of the solution to preventing violence against all women. And I'm excited to let you know that following on from this webinar, we're going to be offering community of practice in addressing masculinities and working with men and boys in the prevention of men's violence against women. We'll have details of those on our website shortly. So you can go to our Prevention in Action website, Googling that, or you can also make sure that you're signed up to our Prevention in Action newsletter. You'll see some links in the chat there. And just lastly, we'd love if you could take 5 minutes to fill out a survey to give us your feedback about today's session. But ultimately, thank you all, and I wish you all a happy and safe end to the year, and I look forward to connecting with you out there in the World Wide Web in the future, in 2023. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.